All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at this idea of meiosis, but not really specifically, mostly just kind of setting up to talk about meiosis and some of the differences between different kinds of organisms, and then just some vocab, actually most of the vocab on the front end, and then the other stuff on the back end. All right, so just as a review, we're going to be looking at meiosis. So we need to talk about a few things that we've learned before, like interphase. Remember, during interphase, the cell is growing, but the important part of interphase is that S phase where DNA is replicated. We talked about DNA replication at the beginning of this unit. DNA replication is important because that's when a copy of the DNA is made. In meiosis, this only happens right at the beginning. And so that's going to be an important concept to make sure that we grab hold of as we go forward. And also understanding the difference between mitosis and meiosis, obviously very important. Mitosis is just making a clone. It's when one cell makes a copy of itself, or a cell splitting in two. There's no way of thinking about it, but understanding that both the resultant cells are genetically identical to one another. Whereas meiosis, there is essentially two divisions that are occurring, and the resultant cells are all haploid, and they are all genetically unique from one another. And there are four of them that are made. And typically, meiosis, when we think of this, we think of the production of gametes. All right, so let's talk about the concept of heredity. We're going to use this term a lot. Heredity just refers to the transmission of traits from one generation to the next by inheriting DNA. You can see here that as you see the couple on the left and their kids, they have traits of both. And the same for the couple on the right. They have traits of both. If you look at my three children and then you look at me and Mrs. Chipman, you can see traits from both of them, but thankfully they mostly resemble her. And this brings us to the concepts of genetics and genes. These are things that we've heard before and you understand, but essentially they all revolve around the DNA being transmitted from one parent or both parents to the offspring, and then how those genes then act on that offspring, because genes carry information about proteins, and proteins do a particular thing, whether that thing is, determine the traits of an organism or something much more specific that is not necessarily seen on the outside. We're going to be talking a lot about the relationship between genes and chromosomes, and then later talking about these with traits. And so this word is not a word that we'll use often, but it's still a helpful understanding, is that on a particular chromosome, which is represented by this purple thing in the middle with the numbers on it, each gene is at a particular location on that chromosome, and it's that way the same, it's that way every single time. And so this term locus just refers to the location of a gene on a chromosome. This will be important when we talk more about meiosis, and then link that together with the concepts of Mendelian genetics. Remember, like the dominant recessive, all that sort of thing. Those things are all intertwined together. And so understanding that genes have a location on a chromosome will be important for us. All right, so in just a brief review of the two types of reproduction, something that you've had since the beginning of time, or at least since, fifth grade or so. There's asexual and sexual reproduction. Big thing here. See how I have one parent up there? I really wish I didn't, because I don't like that distinction. Because the big thing for you to remember that with asexual reproduction, yes, it does only involve one parent. However, a better way of understanding this is when one organism basically creates a clone of itself. All right, this is good for the organism because can happen quickly. You don't have to go out and find a mate. But the problem is, the risk behind this is that all the organisms are the same. And so if there's any sort of selection pressure acting on that organism that is negative, for instance, it would affect all of the organisms, which could be really bad. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, typically involves two parents. Not always. For instance, like an oak tree sexually reproduces, it does not require a second oak tree because it can self-fertilize. And so I like to understand sexual reproduction as the production of gametes and the fertilization, sperm and egg. And there's some benefits here, and they're kind of the opposite of asexual reproduction. The benefit here is there is variation. If you look at the parents and you look at the offspring, there's obvious variation between them, and those variations can lead to adaptations, which can lead to more fitness. We'll get in that when we talk about evolution. Of course, the risk with this is that it takes two. And so, except for in the case of plants, and that's some of the plants and that sort of thing. But there's a need for a mate, and then there's a competition for those mates, and so there's that whole thing that can lead to some risk involved with that. But if you look at life on Earth, generally the most what we quote unquote successful life on Earth has come about through the process of sexual reproduction because of the variation that comes from that. All right, so looking at some different organisms that are sexually reproducing organisms, there are some that are what we would call haploid majority organisms. All right, and a haploid majority organism spends most of its life cycle in the haploid state. All right, they don't have, and this is mostly fungi, but some protists are this way as well. As you can see there on the left, they spend most of their life cycle in the haploid state, and then occasionally will combine to have to form a diploid state, and then go through meiosis again in order to get back to that haploid state. Plants are kind of both and. Remember the alternation of generations with plants? They basically have half and half. They spend half of their life cycle in a haploid state and half in a diploid state. You don't need to remember those terms, at least for this exam, but for the AP exam, you'll need to be familiar with things like sporophytes and gametophytes and that sort of thing. And then animals are what we would call diploid majority organisms, in that the majority of their life is spent in a diploid state, but those diploids can create haploids in order to have sexual reproduction. A couple other things to be aware of. This is a karyotype. Karyotype is just a picture of chromosomes. Why would we be talking about this? Well, because typically karyotypes are done in cells that are called somatic cells, and these are cells that make up most of our body. This is a human karyotype in that there are 46 chromosomes contained in the typical somatic cell for humans. That is 23 pairs of chromosomes. I was talking about this in the previous video, or maybe at the beginning of this one. I don't remember. But anyway, if you can look at these pairs here, here's pair 1, 2, 3, and so forth. One of these came from this individual's mom. The other one came from this individual's dad, and on down the line. And this particular person is female because they have 2 X chromosomes. One of those X chromosomes is from mom. The other one is from dad. Here's a picture of a male karyotype. Same sort of thing, except for with the X and Y, of course. The X comes from mom. The Y has to come from dad because mom doesn't have a Y to give away. And then there are germ cells. Germ cells are also called gametes, and depending on the sex of an organism, be it male or female, they will produce sperm or egg, and then those sperm and egg combine, and that process is called fertilization, and that process makes a structure called zygote, which we covered in the previous video. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how these gametes are made and that specific process that leads to that.